Right. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And welcome to all of you joining us here from across the world for the 10th and the final webinar in the webinar series on international biodiversity law post-2020. This webinar series is organized as part of the annual course on multilateral environmental agreements, which is jointly organized by my home institution, the University of Eastern Finland, as well as the United Nations Environment Programme, UNEP, in collaboration with the Government of Finland. My name is Harro van Asselt, and I'm a professor of climate law and policy with the University of Eastern Finland Law School, and I'll be your moderator today. Now, in this last webinar of our series, we'll be talking about the synergies between tackling biodiversity loss and chemical pollution. And even though we now have many specialized international environmental agreements, it is increasingly clear that tackling environmental problems in silos is ineffective. We need to look for more coherent ways to respond to the inherently linked challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. We therefore need to also urgently develop new tools and innovative ways to address the environmental issues more coherently, not just within the thematic clusters of multilateral environmental agreements, but also such as biodiversity and chemicals, but also across them. Now, the parallel ongoing post-2020 processes for the new global biodiversity framework, as well as the strategic approach to the sound management of chemicals and waste, offers a great impetus for the engagement of the biodiversity and chemicals and waste families. And we already have seen several reports coming out just recently by the Nordic Council of Ministers, as well as the Secretariats from the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Convention and the Minamata Convention. And these reports and this work can help us think on how to capture the synergies, not just at the international level, but also at the national level. And today we now have three great practitioners who will help us to navigate these rather complex interlinkages and highlight the options for strengthening the synergies between international agreements to tackle the problems of biodiversity loss and chemicals and wastes. First up, and I'll introduce the speakers now. First up, we have Jerry Harrison. He is the Principal Technical Specialist at the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center. And for several decades, he has been providing input and guidance to UNEP-WCMC's extensive work in support of intergovernmental agreements and processes relating to biodiversity. And very fitting for today's webinar, most of his day-to-day work concerns the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and his work to identify and promote cooperation and synergies in implementing international agreements and processes. And following on from Jerry's presentation, we'll hear from Claudia and Maria Cristina Cárdenas-Fischer. Claudia is the Senior Policy and Coordination Officer of the Minamata Convention on Mercury. Claudia has been involved in the Mercury Convention since the early days and has been a part of the Minamata Secretariat for several years now. And at the Secretariat, she leads the implementation review and support work. And also, like Jerry, Claudia has been a leading thinker on the interlinkages between multilateral environmental agreements, including through her work with UNEP as well as the United Nations University. And last but certainly not least, we have Maria Cristina, who was a Senior Policy and Strategy Advisor in the Secretariat of the Basel, Rotterdam and Stockholm Conventions, where she's responsible for the provision of policy and strategic advice to the Executive Secretary, including in the context of the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, as well as cooperation with the key partners. So as I indicated already, I think with these three people who have so many decades of experience among them, we certainly have the right people to talk about the linkages between biodiversity and chemicals pollution. Now, before I hand over the floor to Jerry, just a few household remarks. The first remark is what you can probably already see on your screen, is that this webinar is being recorded and will also be shared with you on YouTube through the UEF SEAL channel afterwards. And second, as you can see, there's both a chat box and a Q&A box. Please use the Q&A box for leaving your questions to the panelists, or if you have any comments, you can share them with everyone. You can also upvote each other's comments and questions if you think they should be asked first, and I can monitor that all for the Q&A. So please use the Q&A box, and you can leave the chat box to the side. So with those household remarks I put to the side, Jerry, the floor is all yours to get us started.
I'll unmute first. Thank you very much, Harro, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And in fact, I'm just looking through the list of participants, and I can see quite a number of people I've worked with over the years, and some quite old friends amongst them. So it's great to be here. Just bear with me while I share my screen. I'll be momentarily with you. Can you confirm, somebody, that you can see that screen,
yes,
Harro, please?
We can see it.
Great, thanks very much. So as Harro has said, there'll be three of us talking to you today. I will be speaking first, then I'll be passing over to Maria Cristina, then Claudia, then back to myself. We're all three going to be drawing quite heavily on some ongoing work, some of which you'll have seen, some of which you'll have heard about. I've been working on a project supported by the Nordic Council of Ministers to look at strengthening collaboration and coordination between the biodiversity and chemicals and waste clusters, which is both a study report and an expert workshop that was convened by UNEP. And there's also been work led by the BRS Conventions and Minamata Convention on interlinkages between chemicals and waste and other MEAs in both the biodiversity and the climate change clusters. So we'll be referring to those as we go on through this presentation. So you'll all be very well aware of the threats to biodiversity that were very substantively highlighted by the IPBES Global Assessment, and this is one of the graphics that's taken from the summary for policymakers of the IPBES Global Assessment, and highlighting examples of declines in nature, looking at both drivers and direct drivers. And I'm separating out part of that diagram just to illustrate some of those drivers and direct drivers. And you will see that that sandy coloured portion there is identified as pollution, as one of the 5 direct drivers of biodiversity loss. One of the findings of the global assessment was also that direct and indirect drivers of change have accelerated during the past 50 years. Now, it's important to recognise there are drivers behind this, the indirect drivers. So it's not just a case of pollution just sort of out there. It's driven by those indirect drivers of change. Chemicals and waste are part of the issue over pollution, but the chemicals and waste come about because of human needs and actions. And that's something we will return to in a little while. But I mentioned the IPBES Global Assessment, but right across the assessments that have come out in recent years, and these are some of the assessments that have come out in recent years, looking at different parts of the world, at different habitats, biomes, different issues, have all highlighted concerns over pollution, concerns over chemicals and waste in different ways. And it's important to recognise that these are all drawing on multiple sources. So there's a lot of information coming together that's telling us there are issues, there are problems with biodiversity loss, there are problems with pollution. We've known this for a long time, and that is why a whole range of different intergovernmental agreements have come into being in over recent decades. In the group on the right, you've got some of the chemicals and waste cluster of agreements and processes. The Basel Convention, which deals with transboundary movement of hazardous wastes. You've got the Rotterdam Convention, which deals with international trade in certain hazardous chemicals and pesticides. Stockholm, dealing with persistent organic pollutants. You've got SICAM, which is a policy framework on strategic approach to international chemicals and management. And across in the left, you've got those global biodiversity related conventions that are part of the Biodiversity Liaison Group, which I think most of you will be quite familiar with. But there's a whole range of other international agreements and processes that also relate to the sort of interface between chemicals and waste, pollution and biodiversity, including the Montreal Protocol on ozone, the conventions relating to pollution from ships, the other Rio conventions, climate change and desertification, the law on the sea, the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, the Regional Seas Conventions. There are a whole range of intergovernmental agreements and processes of which these represent a range of them. But overarching over that is the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. Within those goals, there are 5 targets that explicitly relate to management of chemicals and waste or dealing with pollution across several of the SDGs. It's also important to remember that explicit within the 2030 Agenda is the fact that the SDGs and their targets are integrated and indivisible, and calls for interlinkages and integrated nation of the SDGs is of crucial importance in ensuring the agenda is realised. There's a whole range of interconnections between the SDGs, the importance of, for example, better chemicals management reduces pollution, places less stress on biodiversity, better condition of biodiversity contributes to achieving more of the SDGs and targets. So a lot of interconnections within them. So it's also important to recognise there are interconnections between the work that's done relating to different international agreements, different international processes. Yes, they have different objectives, they have different mandates, the different agreements have different memberships, but there are lots of sort of interrelationships between them. The chemicals conventions processes are very much around environmental protection. The Convention on Migratory Species has concerns on risks of poisoning of migratory species and works with some of the chemicals conventions relating to that. The Biodiversity Convention, HE Target 8, is to do with pollution. The impacts of pollution on cetaceans is an issue of big concern within the International Whaling Commission. CITES works on Green Customs Initiative, and that is with a number of the other agreements, including the chemicals agreements. The Regional Seas Conventions are very much about dealing with addressing issues of dumping pollution at sea, as well as about biodiversity protection. So there's lots of potential for interactions and areas where collaboration can provide opportunities for improving and strengthening cooperation. Now I'd like to now pass over to Maria Cristina to start talking about and introduce you a little more to some of the chemicals conventions and the work there. Maria Cristina?
You're still on mute, Maria Cristina.
Apologies. I just had a bit of a malfunction on my side. Thank you very much, Jerry, for that introduction. And I'll just continue. As Jerry mentioned earlier at the beginning of his presentation, together with the Minamata Secretariat, our Secretariat has produced a report on interlinkages between the chemicals and waste MEAs and the biodiversity. But, you know, why are chemicals important? Chemicals and waste are ubiquitous in the environment. They're found all over the globe and they're invisible, yet they're part of our daily lives. The next one. Mercury is a very highly toxic heavy metal that poses a global threat to human health and the environment. It persists in a bioaccumulates and biomagnifies in the food chain. The next. artisanal and small scale gold mining is a problem. The sector demands the largest source of mercury, with virtually all of the mercury released to the environment. Now, just think about what jewelry you wear, what you carry in your pockets, what type of nice decorations you have around that might have gold. There's a link there. The next one. Persistent organic pollutants travel long distances. They're found in the environment around the globe. There are human-made chemicals that persist for very long periods, and they take decades to degrade into less dangerous forms. They evaporate and travel long distances through air and through water, and thus become widely distributed geographically. Next. The accumulation of POPs is also associated with the declining population of marine mammals, such as the Baltic seas, bottlenose and striped dolphins and killer whales. It is also associated with population declines in other fauna. Currently, the levels of PCB remain at a very high level, and their significant exposure is of concern for many of the Arctic biota, including polar bears, killer whales, etc. The levels of these chemicals put this species at very high risk. The next. Pesticides and biodiversity. Sorry, the effects of POPs have been observed in a wide range of ecosystems. We have quite a number of reports that have identified different areas where these POPs have been found. In mangroves, they, for instance, contain a whole suite of chemicals, including POPs. So there is the link there. The next. Pesticides and biodiversity is a very well documented threat to bird life, with bird population having declined from 20 to 25% since the pre-agricultural times, with one of the major causes being pesticides and pesticide poisoning, which is currently the greatest threat to the Andean condor, for instance. So again, this highlights the link. The next. And by affecting insects and pollinators, pesticides also have an impact in a wide range of ecosystems services. For example, while animal pollination directly affects the yield and or quantity of about 75% of global food crop types, pollinators are important beyond agricultural and food production, as their habitats provide ecological, cultural, and financial health and social values. The next. Solid waste. Today's humans extract more than the earth. Sorry, they extract more from the earth and produce more waste than ever before. The best estimate of the global amount of municipal waste, solid waste, is around 2.1 billion tons per year. And this has been increasing at a rate of 33% of that amount, which is managed in an environmentally sound manner. Overall, hazardous waste generation has increased by 50% between 2007 and 2015. Mainly due to the growth in countries with lower and middle and higher middle income. The amount of hazardous waste which is generated was estimated to be 390 to 94 million metric tons in 2015. So it is quite a lot. Next. The e-waste is another one of those growing streams of waste. Look around you, you have a mobile phone, a computer, a tablet. So, you don't see them normally, but your chemicals are there. And e-waste pollution is a huge problem. In 2019, it was estimated that 53.6 million metric tons were generated globally. So that's up to, sorry, it is expected to grow by 2030 to 74.7 metric tons. Next. Now, when we look at one of our favorite topics is the increase of plastic waste in the oceans. There are more than 800 marine and coastal species that are affected by by waste, and this also means chemicals such as POPs. And with the COVID situation, the increase of waste that is being dumped into the oceans has increased. Next. Now, marine plastic debris is also made of chemicals, including POPs. And not only that, but it accumulates contaminants such as POPs, and they can be transported for long-range distances. Macro and microplastics can also transport the invasive alien species, including harmful algal bloom pathogens and the non-native species, with at least 300 species known to disperse by rafting on debris, which can form a new habitat. So it is quite a bit. The next. So why the Basel, Rotterdam, Stockholm, and Minamata Conventions? What has happened over the past 30 years? Governments have negotiated these 4 international legally binding agreements. First, the Basel Convention, which was adopted in 1989, which addresses wastes and their transboundary movement. The Rotterdam Convention, which was adopted in 1998 and entered into force in 2004, which covers the exchange of information on chemicals and certain pesticides. And the Stockholm Convention, which was adopted in 2001, which addresses persistent organic pollutants. Last but not least, the Minamata Convention, the youngest of them all, which was adopted in 2013 and which addresses mercury. Together, these conventions cover quite a broad scope from the geographical point of view. So, you know, the Basel Convention, for instance, has almost universal participation, and so does the Stockholm. The other 2 conventions are coming close to it. Next. The Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm Convention have as their main objective is the protection of human health and the environment. Together, they addressed some of the most significant chemicals and waste pollution which has been identified. Their common objective, as I mentioned, is the protection of human health and environment. Most of the POPs are addressed by the 3 conventions, for example. Many pesticides are also subject to the 3 conventions. And as wastes, all of the chemicals fall under the scope of the Basel Convention eventually. Next. The scope of the Basel, this slide gives you a nice overview of what is addressed by each of these conventions. They each have their own specific niche. I would like to add that currently the Stockholm Convention covers 30 persistent organic pollutants, but that actually goes beyond just 30 chemicals, since now we're starting to cover families of chemicals. And the Rotterdam Convention has the information exchange. Currently, it has 52 chemicals listed under the convention. Next. So what does the Basel Convention do overall? It looks at preventing waste, minimizing, and ensures that there is the environmentally sound management of chemicals within their own territory. It does control the transboundary movement of waste. The Rotterdam Convention. Oh, sorry. I'm going to have to hand it over to Claudia, because I'm being told in the building where I am that there is an emergency and there's an evacuation going on. but I guess I'm finishing. I guess. I have time to finish the next 2 slides. The Stockholm Convention, the Rotterdam Convention, it addresses the exchange of information on chemicals, where parties have to provide an input response on the chemicals listed in the annex. And the Stockholm Convention addresses chemicals that are listed in the convention. As I said, there are 3 annexes that are currently in the convention. I'll pass over now to Claudia, and if I do apologize, I will have to drop off for a moment.
Take care, Maria Cristina. We'll have you back shortly, and let me just use this interlude just for a moment to say that firstly, thank you to Maria Cristina for outlining this joint study that we as 2 secretariats commissioned to look at exactly this interlinkage between the biodiversity world and ours, the so-called chemical world. And when I even say those words, you can just imagine that actually we are, of course, not 2 worlds. We are just sort of 2 legal sets of worlds, or 2 sets of different types of negotiators, or different sectoral negotiators. And very much in our respective secretariats, we felt within the whole context of the post-2020 discussions at CBD and the higher level discussions on the framework that will come, and especially also the 2050 vision for the CBD, that we as our convention would have to understand better the interface and in fact the linkages between our conventions with their respective mandates and what we have in the biodiversity world. And so this report is our very first exploratory sort of well, a type of exploration into how to put these together without going into legally complicated areas or without upsetting our parties or anything like that, but just really to recognize that we are on one planet, and the effects that our conventions are trying to maintain and to minimize are exactly the same effects that also have repercussions in the biodiversity world, and of course also in the climate world. And so that is the report that Maria Cristina presented, and we have also a short version of it, which is a key insights of that you might have been able to flip through already and see that. And I just want to acknowledge that this is not the kind of thing that we as secretariats can just come up with and do it on our own, and we had excellent help also from a legal scholar and former negotiator that was part of all of these 4 conventions, 3 of which Maria Cristina just introduced. And I'll, if you indulge me, just introduce a little bit more about the Minamata Convention, just to show exactly how we in a way intuitively knew we were very linked to the biodiversity world, but still we have to sort of find ways to communicate this both to our parties, but also to have our parties and others, even the biodiversity world, even realize that maybe there's something inside our conventions that's already helpful to the work that they are with their respective parties and stakeholders trying to progress. So with that introduction that I just am squeezing in, as we hope to have Maria Cristina back soon again, I have a couple of slides just to deep dive a little bit more into the Minamata Convention. And this is a picture that you in a way saw earlier, because every single convention and every single of these different agreements also that we have on our planet with whichever specific aim they are trying to introduce is somehow linked to our planetary cycles. And Minamata for Mercury is absolutely no exception, because as you can see here, there are different sources of Mercury. Of course, the Minamata Convention has nothing to do with Mercury coming from volcanoes. No volcanoes have signed up to ratify yet, but we are all about anthropogenic sources. In other words, man, if we have a better term for that, but human-made sources of Mercury that can be minimized or even replaced. And most of those sources go into the atmosphere. Mercury is one of those amazing, it is not only a very poisonous substance, but it is actually a uniquely amazing substance if you think about it, because it is indestructible. And so you will have mercury either in its fluid form, as we all know it, but also it could be in its vaporized form and travel enormous distances and to be deposited in far away places. And it can also, through an interesting but devastating process, actually a biological process, end up not only in the water, but through the water, accumulate in algae and plant and other matters to be ingested by fish, and so become again an entry level into society and the greater environment, and therefore a harm to persons. And this kind of cycling is not only the logic of Minamata, but also in the other convention mentioned, specifically Stockholm. There is this cycle of how a harmful substance moves through us as people, but mostly through the environment, and how we are trying to find ways of mitigating that or stopping that or preventing the harm that comes from there. The next slide is showing you specifically why we have this convention in terms of not only the harm it tries to prevent to the environment, but very much also to persons. And it is because of the air, it is because the emissions to air or the releases to soil and water, and definitely it is through the methylating processes that if this mercury ends up in your fish and progressively goes up to be bioaccumulated by larger fish and larger organisms, the largest of which would be the polar bear, it is simply more and more toxic as you go higher and higher up. And our name, Minamata Convention, comes from a very tragic example of this particular process in the 1950s in Japan, where the beautiful bay of Minamata was devastated. Well, the bay remained the bay, but those people that lived around it, their lives were devastated by the acute mercury poisoning. And just on this note, if you want to see a magnificent film on this, there's actually a film called Minamata that brings to life this particular story. But moving right along to the next slide, how does a convention deal with this? So how does the Minamata Convention deal with this, with mercury, and set the international agenda on it? So the next slide shows what you will probably be familiar with in other types of conventions as well, but certainly Minamata follows a life cycle approach of looking at the beginning. Where do we get the mercury from? From the mercury mines, how it moves through trade, how it gets used in processes and products, and also processes such as ASGM, which I'll stop at for a moment in a minute, how it gets released through emissions and releases, and then what do you do with it in terms of storage, what do you do with the waste, what do you do with the contamination? So it's really a whole around circular approach. The next slide shows you just the articles of, oh, I've got one other slide, which actually shows you how the logic was, in fact, that this life cycle approach would over time reduce the need for mercury, because over time, if you look at, for example, here, you would be down, you would no longer need as much mercury as currently is used in our economy. At least that is the hope. So looking at the gold, very, very broad arrow, you will see that an enormous amount of mercury is actually used in the artisanal and small scale gold mining world, and equally an enormous amount of that mercury that is used is immediately wasted into, polluted into the environment. There are other processes that use mercury. The industrial processes, under many circumstances, cycle it better back into industry. But many of those processes we now know no longer need mercury, which is in some ways an archaic way of doing many of forms, such as chloralkali doesn't have to be the way we produce chlorine. We can do it in other ways, for example, and other such processes. So just giving you this picture in terms of how the convention is set up to try to, over time, reduce the need to use mercury, and therefore also the risk for the remainder of the mercury or the excess mercury to either find its way into the environment where it's harmful to the environment and humans, or other ways. But the next slide, in a way, sums. I think I'm in a loop. Okay, this looks good. We go on to the emissions. Perfect. If we go to the next slide. So looking at the mercury that is released, gold here signifies again the enormous amount of mercury that comes from artisanal small-scale gold mining. This is these statistics are taken from the 2018 assessment in terms of emissions to air. And you will see here the enormous amount of mercury that is released and therefore harmful, both to those that live around it in the landscapes immediately and others as well. The dark blue I'd like to draw your attention to, because I'll stop there for a moment as well, is mercury from coal-fired power station and other such stationary combustion type of station. So there is an enormous amount of mercury that, just as coal is a wondrous element in a way that we have in our planet, just as you burn the coal, you are very likely also going to be burning some mercury in the process, and it would require some more complex setups to ensure that the mercury is released, is removed from the entire coal combustion process. So I'll stop there in a moment, but to tell you a bit more about coal, but I'd like you just to see exactly where it goes, and then to, in a way, see this within the biodiversity sector as well. So the next slide shows you, or here I try to just pictorially show you what we see in ASGM in artisanal small-scale gold mining. So the next slide firstly shows you literally a very typical situation in Kenya. These pictures come from Kenya, but artisanal small-scale gold mining, in other words, not formal gold mining, but gold mining that happens just outside. It's very often an informal sector, happens in many, many, many places around the world. It employs many women, it employs very many children. And as you can see in a way from these beautiful pictures, is also, it is very much close to nature. And if it's done in a way where the mercury is not contained or so, that is an immediate pollutant, not only of harm to the people themselves, but to the entire landscapes around it. And as Maria Cristina said, one of the aims that we do also within the convention is to really question, or put the question out, is there a responsible supply chain all the way up on gold products? But just to move on with the next slide here, and we try to show this also in that report that we put together. On the one side, on the left side, you see the areas where there is the most artisanal gold mining happening. And you can see in a way, if you look at the picture on the right, which is this beautiful blue picture of our world, but also the heat, if you can may look at it as a sort of as a heat map. This is actually a biodiversity, a mega biodiversity map. And if you put those two together, you will see that so much of this artisanal small-scale gold mining is happening in the areas of the world that we would want to be most protective of because of their planetary nature, again, and functions, again, in terms of ecosystem services and many other items that we hold dear under the CBD and other of the biodiversity-related conventions. And so these two maps, in many ways, there are far too many places where they overlap, and we really are trying to make also the point about, especially now in this decade of restoration, to look at this very real need of looking at how small-scale gold miners are being supported to move away from mercury. And very last is just that I wanted, the next slide is just to make, since we are just post-Glasgow, just to make the point about coal, climate, and biodiversity. So looking at the next slide, this is again from the same report I mentioned earlier, the 2018 report. And the gold again represents on a regional level where we have emissions from small-scale gold mining, but the dark blue is from coal. And this is mercury emissions from coal combustion. But if you look at similar such pie graphs in terms of just simply coal combustion or coal use for energy needs around the world, you will find, of course, a very similar picture. And so one just has to also make the point that whatever we do within Minamata is not only related very closely to our links to biodiversity, but also to our hopes and ambitions under the climate agreement. And the very last slide that I have here before I hand over is, I mean, I'm sure you are so familiar with these pictures of a place of air pollution with or without. This work on Minamata with Mercury is extremely relevant to any effort on air pollution, any effort on climate. But then also, if one just looks at these enormous coal mines and what they do to our landscapes, any effort to move to minimize or to downscale or to phase down or phase out coal, and so would not only help us on Mercury overall, it would also be a dividend for many other of the aims that we have at a global level. With that, I want to hand back to Jerry, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's extremely interesting for us, and well, certainly for me, having worked on biodiversity most of my professional life, to see some of the background to the chemicals conventions and how they work. And I apologize for the slide skipping a bit and slow changing. For some reason, my laptop has decided suddenly that the normal keys for changing slides are not going to work, and I'm having to do it by the rollerball on my mouse, which is not the easiest way of changing slides. So I'm just going to come back to a little bit more on the process of strengthening collaboration. I've got here a picture which many of you might recognize the actual picture and the actual location, but it's something that's very familiar, I think, to quite a number of people who are on the presentation today. This is actually from CBD COP in Egypt. But something quite a number of us have been working on, you've been dealing with in the course, is the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And this is obviously important context for what we're talking about today. But what many of you may be less familiar with is there's actually another process ongoing, which is looking at the strategic approach and sound management of chemicals and waste beyond 2020. So it's another process that's ongoing, also interrupted in part in the difficulties of COVID affecting negotiations and discussions. But just wanted you to be well aware that these things are both going on at the moment and both are relevant to what we're talking about. So as I said, I've been working on a project that's looking at opportunities for strengthening collaboration, cooperation between the biodiversity and chemicals and waste clusters, on an anticipation that strengthening that cooperation and collaboration can lead to benefits. This has gone on through a desk study that was carried out by myself in UNEP-WCMC. That's been, we've peer reviewed 2 drafts of the study. There was an expert consultation workshop that was convened by UNEP, where some of the options for action were discussed and people shared their own experiences. And all this has been overseen by a steering committee provided by the Nordic Council of Ministers as part of the project. And some of the work that's been described by Maria Cristina and Claudia was drawn on also in doing this. So we think there are a number of areas of mutual interest across the sectors. Whether you're working in the biodiversity or the chemicals and waste sector, you're interested in understanding the potential impacts of chemicals and waste on biodiversity and understanding the pathways they move through, understanding the social and financial implications of damage to biodiversity, interested mutually in reducing risks to and impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services, achieving more integrated cross-sectoral approaches, promoting cooperative action, also using biodiversity to reduce the impacts of chemicals and waste, and also looking to improve delivery and impact of major international initiatives. I think these are all areas in which across the sectors we're all interested in delivering. Yeah, my keyboard is still not changing on the right keys. So there are a number of key actors in doing this. We're talking about intergovernmental agreements and implementation of them. So obviously a lot of it is about national and local governments and the actions that they take to implement all of the agreements and processes that they're party to or sign up to in some way, working as appropriate with their own national stakeholders and their own local governments. Clearly, the intergovernmental agreements and processes, each of the intergovernmental agreements and processes themselves have a role in this, working independently or as appropriate, working together. There are a number of organizations working at regional and global levels who support governments, support parties, member states in their implementation of the different agreements and processes. So these are all areas where the actions might be taken to strengthen implementation where it is needed. Obviously, there are other players like the research community, academia, the private sector, who also have a role to play in this sort of area. Now, in terms of actions to strengthen cooperation and collaboration, there's no point in taking action unless it's going to be useful and successful. So we identified a number of characteristics of what might be a successful approach, drawing on earlier experience, including the experience of the BRS conventions, in which when they carried out their own synergies process, including experience across the regional seas. So the characteristics of a successful approach were identified as approaches which might strengthen implementation and increase efficiency and cost effectiveness. Often the more effective actions are those that are led from the national level, supported as appropriate internationally, and the national level where implementation is actually happening. Approaches that comprise manageable actions, they're stepwise, they're slow and steady almost, using pragmatic approaches to address identified needs, and that's very important, addressing identified needs. Approaches that identify mutual dependencies, common issues that can be addressed together, common targets to focus action more effectively. For example, the pesticides and pollinators was a key issue where there's a common interest in addressing things. Also, successful approach actions need to respect the autonomy of the different instruments. They're legal instruments, the legal autonomy, and they need to respect that and avoid politically charged discussions. So a number of characteristics of what might be a successful approach. So we identified sort of 4 basic strategies under which the options for action are clustered. So my mouse is playing up. Now our mouse is playing up. Not doing very well here. So the first option is strengthening implementation mechanisms. So everybody's already taking action at the national level to implement. What can be strengthened there for each of them? Working together to achieve common aims, coordinating common needs and services, advancing key international initiatives. So these are 4 sort of strategic approaches under which I've clustered a number of options for action. So I'm going to go through briefly options for action within each of these areas. So firstly, on strengthening implementation mechanisms, there's each of the MEAs, each of the processes have national focal points. So one key area is ensuring those national focal points know each other and have opportunities to come together, build personal relationships, and work together on areas of common interest. So it's about relationships, but it's also about relationships amongst the institutions responsible for implementation to ensure there's a degree of continuity. So you need institutional mechanisms in place to bring the representatives of competent national authorities together on issues of common interest. For each of the MEAs and processes, or for the majority of them, there are plans put in place at the national level. So for example, under the Convention on Biological Diversity, it will be NBSAPs. And it's ensuring that you're thinking about the other sectors, the other actions that could be included within those, the cross linkages that could be made in each of those plans, not just NBSAPs, but the plans for implementing other conventions where it is appropriate to do so. And also, but there are also potentially actions that could be taken at the international level, working with each of the independent international agreements to provide additional support. So what might be needed in terms of support that can be taken through each of the individual instruments that will support that collaboration across sectors? working together to achieve common aims. An obvious one might be communications relating to the interconnections between biodiversity and chemicals and waste. If we can come up with common messaging rather than individually within each cluster, clearly it is going to be more powerful, it's going to reach more people, and being seen to be working together through this is also a more powerful approach to political support. Working together in the identification of risk and contingency planning, collaborating in improving the governance arrangements, planning and implementation, promoting and supporting research in key areas, and initiating cross-cluster collaborative projects, all ways in which we can work together to achieve common aims. And working together to achieve those aims strengthens the collaboration and hopefully increases efficiencies. And clearly, many people are already doing this. It's a matter of learning from the people who are already doing it to support those areas where it's not currently happening. With opportunities to coordinate common needs and services. So, for example, this is to do with the means of implementation, the enabling activities. There's other opportunities for cooperation and collaboration in monitoring, reporting, and the use of indicators. Can you get benefits from increased coordination of capacity building, increased coordination of technical and scientific cooperation, technology transfer? Is the opportunity to be gained by facilitating sharing of guidance materials more widely, or increasing the cross-reference between different clusters within those guidance materials? Is there opportunity to collaborate more in the development and use of effective science policy interfaces? Each of these, it's about building on what's already there, using what's already there. But I want to stress again, there's no one size fits all. It's a matter of which of these options for action is useful in different circumstances. Then there's a whole range of international initiatives that could be advanced and could be beneficial in looking at cross-sector collaboration. Further promotion of the importance of nexus issues, so the interconnected nature of issues is better appreciated. And of course, the future IPBES assessment relating to nexus issues could be extremely valuable in this area. The One Health approach could be a very valuable driver for dealing with both biodiversity and chemicals and waste issues. Are there opportunities to encourage finance institutions and programs to support actions that address environmental issues in an integrated manner? And some of the outcome of the recent Jeff Council meeting is quite interesting in this regard, from what was being said about the importance of interconnections and working together. And the promotion of regional cooperation as a basis for strengthened cooperation. In the workshop, people were talking about regional collaboration as being a safe space for countries to come together to discuss areas of common interest. But there's also opportunities for example, through the regional centres that are convened by some of the chemicals and waste conventions, the regional Cs I mentioned earlier, all potential areas of collaboration. So all of these options for action were discussed in the workshops that I mentioned earlier and in the study report. But we also discussed what would be the next steps, because we've got these options for action, we've got a report and a workshop report identifying these. So the options for next steps that we identified were the importance of communicating the reports to the secretariats, parties and other stakeholders for each of the agreements. And that included communication to the leaders of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and beyond 2020 process relating to chemicals management. This could be through direct communication to people, obviously also communication through information documents to the processes dealing with it. We can introduce the reports in the formal discussions on cooperation under the different agreements, basically trying to take the agenda forward in this way where it's useful to do so. We encourage discussion of the reports in the coordination meetings, and I'm thinking here of the Biodiversity Liaison Group, the Joint Liaison Group, the Environment Management Group under the UN. There's a whole range of these different coordination groups where these issues could be usefully raised. Also raising the profile of the issues within UNEP and UNEA, and drawing reports to the attention, for example, of the GEF and potentially other finance institutions. Briefing the regional centres under the Basel and Rotterdam conventions that I've just referred to, and community. But we also stress the importance to the participants in the workshop of the importance of communicating issues with their own constituencies. And in fact, the moderator, my own director, Neville Ash, at the end of the workshop on this issue, asked participants to say what they were going to do to communicate the importance of strengthening this collaboration after the meeting finished. And a whole range of interesting things came forward from that. Now, you might ask also, what relevance is this to the upcoming CBD meetings? And I would argue that a lot of what we're talking about here in terms of strengthening collaboration and coordination is relevant within the discussions on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, and indeed within the monitoring framework that are going to be discussed in the meetings in January. And these issues will come up, relevant issues on that will come up within Substar, SBI and the working group on post-2020. They're also relevant to the discussion on cooperation that will come up in the SBI meeting, but also to the strategic framework for capacity building that's being discussed under the CBD in the SBI meeting, which is talking about the importance of cooperation across different processes within the drafts that are in front of parties for negotiation. So there's a whole range of areas where this will come up in the future. So I've largely gone through what we wanted to present. I just want to finish on one final slide, because one of the things I want to encourage people to think about is the actions that they could be taking and other actions that could be proposed. We've presented here a whole range of ideas, and I've presented a whole range of options for action. There are doubtless other options for action. There are doubtless things that people are already doing that could be built on. And part of what we want to do is to encourage that learning and that sharing of experience. So with that, Harro, I'd like to hand back to you, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Right. Thank you very much, Jerry, and thank you also to Claudia and Maria Cristina, and I hope that Maria Cristina is fine wherever she is. Maybe we'll see her popping back on later on, but for now the main thing for her is to be safe wherever she is. So I've looked at some of the questions that have come in. I think there's a few quite specific to you, Claudia, about the Mercury regulation, but I'll get to those in a second, because I want to start with maybe a few broader questions first for maybe both of you. And one question that I had, given that both of you have been thinking about interlinkages for a very long time, Jerry was actually just looking up, I think one of the first things where I saw your name on this was in 1997 or so. So you've been thinking about this for a very, very long time indeed. And what you're presenting here is quite a positive action agenda. So these are some of the next steps in which Synergies can actually be promoted at the national level, at the regional level, some of the actions that can be taken also through intergovernmental organizations, through liaison groups, etc. You've given us a very good and long and interesting list to think about, and lots of next steps. But I want to take one step back and ask you a little bit about the barriers that we'll likely encounter in this process, or in trying to pursue synergies across these two thematic clusters. Based on also your experiences in the biodiversity area, but maybe also based on the experiences in the BRS synergies process. So whether it's memberships that might not align, or whether it's a lack of information, whether it's a lack of budgets from secretariats. What are some of the common challenges or the likely challenges that we'll probably need to overcome if we want to actually move ahead with some of the next steps that you've outlined?
Shall I go first and then pass to one of the others? And you're quite right. I think the first document I was involved with that talked about cooperation and synergies, which is, I must admit, a word I often try and avoid. I think it was 1997. The first meeting I organised was in 2000, and I see one of the participants is Tony Gross, and I'm fairly sure he was at that meeting, and we were discussing those issues back then. So yes, it is an issue that's been around a long time and discussed a long time, and it's an issue that's just been discussed both within the biodiversity cluster, within the chemicals and waste cluster, and I don't know whether Maria Cristina might want to say something about the BRS Synergies process and how that came about. So I'm just giving a heads up on that, but she's probably already thought about that. So yes, it's interesting that when we started talking about cooperation and synergies within the biodiversity, we were very much talking about cooperation internationally at the global level and within the conventions. Nowadays, we're talking much more about cooperation and the synergies that can be achieved in cooperation in implementation at the national level. And I think that's actually it's not, I was going to say it's a subtle change, not a subtle change, it's a really obvious change, but it's a really important change on the ground. And that's one of the reasons why it's important to stress what we're presenting. These are a whole range of options on what can be done, because quite clearly different countries are at different stages. They have different memberships of conventions. They work in different ways. In some cases, they have different legal systems. So there need to be options for action. That's also why it's valuable learning from one another and setting up processes where they will learn from one another, because the sharing of experience between peers is far more powerful than something top-down telling somebody what they could and should be doing. So I think that's extremely important. Some of the barriers, part of the barrier may be we're in different silos at different times, and that's obviously, again, it's different ways in different countries. And breaking down silos is somewhat difficult at times. I mean, that's slowed down what's known as the mainstreaming agenda in lots of different ways, because people tend to be separated, and the need to bring them together and increase thinking across takes time and effort, and very often people don't have the time, which is why in that list of key characteristics I gave, one of the characteristics is sort of having clearly focused aims in doing something. So know what benefit you want to achieve and work towards that benefit, not work on a big broad front, but identify things you can do in stepwise stages. So that's enough from me, though. I'm happy to come back to it again, Harro, but Maria Cristina or Claudia?
Thanks, Jerry. And apologies to everyone again for having disappeared so quickly, but I'm back and all is good. I just wanted to refer a bit to the synergies process that we had under the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm conventions, and why it was so important. It was very important that very early on, parties to our conventions recognized that each of this instrument was legally sort of autonomous. And so they never attempted at actually merging the instruments, but at looking at how together we could work towards implementing better on the ground those three agreements. And so the process looked at what could be done at the global level, at the regional level, and at the national level. At the global level, what did happen was the merging of the three secretariats into one big secretariat that still works on the three conventions. And by doing so, we also are able to ensure that there is a better coordination both at the regional level and at the national level, because we approach in similar ways our parties and those that participate in implementing our conventions. But now the shift, very similar to what Jerry mentioned, has focused on actual implementation on the ground. So this is the most difficult part, is this coordination and cooperation at the national level. Just because over time we've been able to build so many silos you know, we've been very good at sort of building separate instruments and separate ways of to proceed. So now that is the challenge. It's dealing with the barriers. But you know, there are many ways of overcoming them, and one of the ways where, you know, we have started doing something is by ensuring, for instance, doing this work on the linkages between biodiversity and the chemicals and waste, as well as with climate change, because there are many actions that you can take at the national level that, in, you know, applying them, you actually benefit the work that needs to be done both under the chemicals and waste conventions, but also under biodiversity or under climate change. I will just stop here.
And Harro, if I may add a reflection, and I just want to also call out Tony Gross. It's very nice to be on a call with you, because Tony and I met many years ago at UNU, where we all worked on interlinkages, and that was sort of the word we used before we started using synergies per se, and in some quarters it's still easier to speak about interlinkages. But just to say, you know, I think a lot has been written about why something works or why it hasn't quite worked, so I think I cannot add to that sort of analysis and what Jerry and Maria Cristina outlined in terms of the renewed emphasis or new emphasis now at the national level of implementation cannot be underestimated as a really, I think, a good moment forward. But if I reflect on, you know, what are basically 20 years of trying to make this work, or whether we go the BRS way of actually convening or, you know, putting it in one secretariat, or in another way, Minamata is a separate secretariat, but we work extremely, we even sit right next to BRS on the same, in the same building, and we work very closely together. But if I really look at what's all happened, I cannot sort of deny just the normal human element here. In other words, it's sort of nobody's fault. Because if we look at, for example, those that started the groundbreaking work on the Basel Convention, some of those stayed around and were part of those that made the groundbreaking work on the Rotterdam Convention to even put in place such a notification system. Then some of those stayed around and became sort of the first thinkers of why we need the Stockholm Convention. And I must say, many of those that worked most, you know, at the beginning of the Minamata Convention came from the Stockholm experience. So partly it's like an iterative process of learning and trying to make it better every time, make it better every time. But the other thing is that there's sort of a family of people that become sort of custodians of this. Of course, new people go in and they get integrated, but you can literally trace year-long, decade-long friendships, maybe even some marriages and some children, I don't know, through this entire being. And the same thing I know is completely true on biodiversity, where some people also say they've seen their fellow negotiators more than their mothers-in-laws and, you know, brothers and sisters and so on and so forth. So there is a fundamental, normal human element to this. And the other, not that I know what to fix here, but I think it's something to say. And the other one is that I think our conventions, all of them, biodiversity, chemicals, all of them, are very specific animals or megafauna, whatever, or flora, whatever you'd like to call them. And so you need like a more and more, like there's almost like a logic built on you of you have to become more of a specialist to maintain it, and then become more of a specialist because it just becomes more and more complex. And if you kind of miss the train, you just want to go in transversally, it takes you a lot of time to actually get up to speed with where we're at, to make that, you know, really impactful difference. And you know, the train is kind of left, and you really can't just jump in. And that's why I think the fact that we have this moment in history, pandemic now aside, where we have the biodiversity world looking in on itself and asking itself what is with our 2020 framework, and the chemical world doing that too, and we in our conventions having our own timelines, it just provides, I think, an opportunity none of us have ever had to really try to break through these, whether we call them silos or a speciality bunkers, because we are only, you know, speaking about Minamata or whatever it is that is your aim. And I make this plea also because I think in our worlds, we don't often look at the psychology of things, you know, psychology of negotiations, psychologies of getting deals done, psychologies of how do you fund something. We speak very sort of abstractly and bureaucratically about things that we need to get done, or legalistically. At the end of it, each of our agreements is a deal. each of them is a deal, and we are custodians of these deals. And whether we are in the Secretariat or whether we are parties, we are custodians of those deals, and we need to try to implement them. And I think sometimes we don't appeal to that enough. We let them lie around like they're paper dragons or tigers or whichever it is that you like. Let me stop here.
Thanks, Claudia. Very, very provocative and very thoughtful. Question that I want to reflect again to maybe all of you, and I'll take a few of the comments that I saw and suggestions that I saw from the Q&A together. And because I think they point to rather more radical overhaul from, let's say, the current options and the current next steps that Jerry presented in terms of dealing with the overlaps between MEAs. And the first one that was voiced is like, well, why don't we get rid of, let's say, these smaller conventions and just create one big chemicals and waste convention that deals with everything? So we know, of course, how we got to the different chemical convention, but rather taking like a step-by-step or chemical by chemical approach, let's bring it all together in one big convention. So that will be the first like major possible overhaul. And then the second, well, maybe not necessarily overall, but quite radical approach would be to adopt a hierarchy. And there's one suggestion made in the Q&A there. Well, we know that biodiversity protection is very important, so why don't we just subsume other treaties to the goals of the Biodiversity Convention and make sure that whatever decision is made on the approval or consent on a chemical, to make sure that that is aligned with biodiversity goals. So what I basically want you to do is to reflect on some of these more radical options and whether to you they make sense or whether they're feasible, or whether you think that the current approach, which is maybe not as radical but at least makes gradual progress in a number of years, might be preferable after all. So whoever wants to respond to that, you can unmute yourself.
Well, I'll have a first go at bits of it. It's as you said, slightly radical. I think it goes against some of the characteristics of what might be a successful approach that I mentioned earlier, and part of that is taking pragmatic and practical steps. We have to remember that each of the MEAs we're talking about is essentially an independent entity. It's got its own objectives, its own mandate, adopted many years ago in some cases, and it's got its own membership. So each of them have their own governance and advisory bodies. Now clearly they're the same countries that are part of it, but they're party to many different agreements, and each of those agreements is independent and has its own legal autonomy. I'm not a lawyer, I haven't got a legal background, but it seems to me a political minefield to work on trying to bring those things together, which is why I prefer to work from the practical and pragmatic end of looking for ways to increase the cooperation at the global level and at the national level, and take pragmatic steps to achieve it. But it's in that, let me turn that around. It's in the hands of parties to make those changes, not in the hands of myself working with the UN in different ways or with the secretariats. But let me pass to one of the secretariats.
I'd have a go at this. And actually, I think this is a very interesting discussion, and it takes me back in time. And I have to say that when we embarked in negotiating the chemicals and waste conventions, there was a possibility in front of us of actually looking at a global framework convention on chemicals. And the reason why, many governments at the time decided not to go in that direction was because it was believed that it was much better to be very pragmatic about it and practical, and that there was a possibility of achieving more, getting farther, if we took a stepwise approach. And so eventually, this is how the different conventions came about. So the Rotterdam came, then the Stockholm Convention, and they're quite specific and they have a very particular niche. But it doesn't mean that in having that particular niche, they don't also provide benefits in managing chemicals and waste overall. Because, for instance, when you do work on the Stockholm Convention, when you have to develop a national implementation plan, you need to do inventories of chemicals. And when you're inventorying them, you don't actually know that what you have in front of you are only POPs, for instance. So you end up, it has sort of an expanded impact. Now, I take a step back and I see, well, yeah, sure. Now I look at what the situation is and the fact that we have quite a number of MEAs working on chemicals and waste, and wouldn't it be nice to have a framework convention? Well, from the practical point of view, I'm not too sure how feasible that is. And this is just my personal opinion. It does take many years to negotiate. And what do we prefer? To invest time in negotiating what we think might be a perfect agreement, or to use what we have and make it work better? And I think that this is where the synergies process within the BRS conventions, was a very positive outcome. It tried to deal and address that issue of having a framework convention without necessarily, renegotiating disagreements, which are legally binding. And so it does, in effect, contribute to implementing the three conventions in a more harmonized way, which looks at the global package. And I would just, look and say, well, what is it that is not included in those conventions? What is it that is not being addressed currently? These are conventions that over time have demonstrated that they do sort of adapt to the changing times. And so new chemicals get included. For instance, now there are a number of plastic additives that are being considered under the Stockholm Convention. And so, they are adapting to the changing times. But what is it that doesn't fall under the scope of the four conventions, if I include Minamata? And for that, that's where SAICM actually fits in. It does have this more overarching scope that allows others to also come in and implement activities in areas that are not addressed by the conventions. So that's my contribution to this. And as I said, my personal opinion from experience of having been involved both on the government side and then with the secretariats.
So if I may add, I would underline everything Jerry and Maria Cristina have said. And this is not because I don't like order and, nicely packaged framework agreements where everything is on one page. I love creating order everywhere and make everything work out nicely. But I think that we have achieved more in our chemicals world by being specific than trying to be all-encompassing. These four conventions that you have, and they're not static. I mean, the Basel Convention had a very interesting amendment to it that Maria Cristina can explain much better than me, where plastics was added in a way that we need now. So there are also evolutions again in our different conventions. But I would say that we created, a hard set of stepping stones across this morass of need in the chemical world on these very specific items. Mercury is one of the most tricky heavy metals. There are others. There were some that wanted to have a heavy metals convention with cadmium and other things in it as well. I mean, I would have liked that. That would have been nice and neat, but we didn't get it. We only got mercury. But if we do something about mercury all the way through, like I was trying to say, we'll also do something about coal. We'll also do something about many other aspects. Isn't that worth going for, gunning for something that is really there and agreed to, legally agreed to, than trying to have everything and then, having to do sort of the Christmas tree or shopping tree approach. So over the years, I've become less sort of wanting everything and just very happy about very specific things that we can have, that we can step on. And on this one, I also want to just mention that the negotiators of these conventions, and we don't speak that always about ozone, but we also extremely aware, and we are also very much in touch with our ozone colleagues, although it's a slightly different convention, but we were always looking at not duplicating anything. So anything that's covered inside Minamata is not covered inside Basel, is not covered inside Rotterdam, is not covered inside Stockholm. It is really about this element. Having said that, we didn't reinvent the waste guidelines. We are applying the Basel waste guidelines to Mercury. We didn't reinvent the notifications on Mercury compounds. We are applying the Rotterdam notifications on compounds. So we kind of we take the tools that we have elsewhere and reinforce them. And yes, you know, there's this thing of membership. So we have some parties that the Basel, Rotterdam, and Stockholm don't have, and they have some parties because they're a bit older and have had a bit more time to get people on board that we don't yet have. And at times that creates a bit of friction, but then politics usually can deal with it. So I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the alpha and omega of why something doesn't work. And maybe just this last point, I really think more about the fact that these conventions have woven together a type of tapestry. And I think that's sort of more the way we have to go. Or another metaphor I often like to use is that it's more like acupuncture. Like you can't fix everything, but you can put a needle here, you can put a needle there, you can put a needle here, and then you can try to move the bigger picture. But I do say, or I must admit, that, and there was an interesting article in The Guardian yesterday, we have not done enough to get the chemical industry completely on board. And here we all have so much work to do. And this is a very, very complicated topic because the chemical industry is a major, major part of all economies, of all forms of development. And that is something we have to do more on. It's actually not so much the governments per se, unless you would like to see the governments as in the enablers of industry, but it is more, we need to go beyond what we have now. That is for sure something that I would say we need more of, but maybe in this climate context where industries and businesses are stepping forward and asked to step forward, maybe there's hope that they can actually come forward and not only give their knowledge or their lobbyists, but actually literally be part of the parcel. Thanks.
Thanks, Claudia. Then I want to take up another question, and I might rephrase it a little bit just to try and get it clear. But so it's a question about the role of the SDGs, and I'm also indeed wondering how do the SDGs fit into this discussion that we're having on interactions and synergies between the chemicals cluster and chemicals and waste cluster on the one hand, the biodiversity cluster on the other hand. Where do the SDGs come in? Like, do they come in the implementation, in the monitoring, or are there other ways where you see that the SDGs process, whether through the HLPF or through the voluntary national reviews, have a role to play in strengthening the interlinkages? Jerry, you want to go first?
I seem to be going first each time. So yes, so I mean the SDGs are an important packaging of global goals and targets, and embrace many of the targets that already exist within a range of the different agreements that are out there. So it already embodies a lot of what we're doing in the different places, but it also very clearly states and is very seen as being a sort of integrated package. And I mentioned that earlier on. Achievement of some of the targets requires achievement of other targets. There's an integration within them. You made specific mention of indicators. I think that's actually quite important as we develop the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and the monitoring framework for that. And as the discussions in the intersessional process on Beyond 2020 and SICAM, both are looking at indicators, and there's a lot of call for using indicators in in a common way, rather than each separate process and convention agreeing or wanting to go for different sets of indicators. There's a lot of push behind that. So I think the SDGs should be seen as a push towards integration in its own right, the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, I should say, the package of the two. So I see it as an important framework, and of course a framework that's recognized at the national level and is reported on at the high level platform. So let me pass on to others.
Maybe what I could add is, in fact, our study, the one that the BRS and the Minamata, we actually, there's a chapter at the end where we kind of map things against specific SDGs. So that might be an entry for somebody that would like to deep dive a bit there. But just to say that of all the SDGs, there is, of course, one where we find ourselves most in. But I would like to also say that just sort of on the internal bureaucratic process that we as our Secretariat, and I know this is also done by the BRS, we actually contribute to the overall reporting through the SG on all of this as well. And so, you know, whether it is the number of parties that we have and how they have, you know, taken on the obligations, the legal obligations that then downstream are supposed to be affecting the quality of water and then all kinds of other things. This, it gets fed on a regular basis into the SG's reporting. So that happens there. And also, I mean, when the focus comes onto chemicals, our respective executive secretaries are invited to contribute, or our secretariats in different ways, to the political dialogue. But I want to also say that one of the big things that I find very interesting right now in the UNEP landscape is that our executive director, Inga Andersen, really makes a very strong push for the narrative of 3 crises, and that all of this, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the pollution, and that we don't look at this anymore in such a disparate way. And then, you know, when we go to our specific parties, we have parties, UNEP has member states, we are immediately confronted with those that need to look at it through the SDG prism. So it sort of is part of our constant dialogue, whether it is us in the UN vis-a-vis either headquarters UNEP, if we think of UNEP as a headquarters in terms of all of environment, but also the SG, but also even in our direct interactions. And just as an example, for part of the funding mechanism for the Minamata Convention, there's the big part is the GEF, and the smaller part called the Specific International Program. And there, one of the items that was put there by Conference of the Parties was to show that it's also in the service of SDGs. And we have this because we were a convention, the text was finalized in 2013. So we could build in all of these things now and sort of, you know, be part of the newer narrative. Of course, the older ones, and Maria Cristina will be able to speak to that more, maybe here and there that had to adjust it a bit differently, but they just as part of this reporting cycle.
Yeah, and just to add to what both Jerry and Claudia have said before, and summarizing a bit their contributions, I think that the SDGs and the Chemicals and Waste Conventions are mutually supportive. So in implementing the obligations under our 4 conventions, we help in achieving the goals set out in the SDGs, and vice versa. By implementing the SDGs, then we contribute to ensuring that our conventions are fully implemented.
Right. There were a few more questions, but we're also very close to the half hour, so to the allotted time. So I do want to wrap it up here and draw a line at this stage. So let me start by thanking all 3 of our speakers, so Jerry, Claudia, and Maria Cristina, for their presentation, for their overview of all of the many activities that are ongoing and that will likely continue to be ongoing also in the near future. Thanks also for the questions and comments that we received in the Q&A. Some very interesting comments and questions were raised. But also maybe at the end of the webinar series that we find ourselves now, so at the end of 10 webinars on international biodiversity law post-2020, I would just like to thank everyone who's been joining us for these webinars. And looking at the list of people, I can see a number of people who have been very diligent in following pretty much all of the webinars. So I'm very thankful for those of you who have been coming here pretty much Tuesday after Tuesday to listen in to these to this webinar series. So on behalf of the organizing team, so University of Eastern Finland, as well as the UN Environment Programme, thanks so much for joining us. And we hope that ultimately the series has been useful to you in your work, in your education, or whatever you're doing. So thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to connecting with you again in the future. So thanks everyone, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.